Slides okay?
Yep.
Great, thank you. I'm Jake Gross. I'm an associate professor of higher ed administration at University of Louisville. I want to talk about, this is very much a project that is in progress that I've been working on with a colleague, Jen Geiger, who is actually in social work, and then Greg King, who is in higher education, but has experience in the foster care system. So this project we've been working on, this is, I would argue, a very understudied group in higher education, particularly among those of us who identify as higher education researchers. Most of the literature right now is in social work. And so this is something that I've gotten into really for two reasons. One is I got tenure and I decided I would start doing more of what I wanted to do, but also I've been a foster parent for a number of years. So just some quick disclaimers here. The data I'm using, any misinterpretations, it's not the fault of the federal government or the fine folks at Cornell that provide the data. And as I said, this is a work in progress. I welcome feedback, critiques, pushback on this, but this, I would ask you not to circulate the slides. I've already noticed a couple of mistakes in them, unfortunately. So just to kind of talk about kind of the genesis of this work, right? So I study financial aid. That's mostly what I do. But as I mentioned, I'm a foster parent, and was doing some work with NPSAS, the National Post-Secondary Student Aid Study 2016, which has included for at least 3 iterations, question 53 from the FAFSA there, which is this very, I think, bizarrely worded question about where you a ward of the state, an orphan, and there's something else in there. And so you can sort of get a sense if someone was in foster care from the time they were 13. But in 2016, for students that didn't fill out the FAFSA, they included in the follow-up calls, they asked them that question. So we got information about folks who may have been in foster care, but did not apply for financial aid. And we saw this. Okay, so we saw that there was about a 16-point difference between youth that had been in care and low-income or first-generation students in terms of receiving financial aid. So if you're not familiar with foster care, if you are among those that have been in care and or age out of the system, there is, especially in the past 20 years, there have been a fair number of policies passed to provide you with education and training once you get out of the foster care system. So this really surprised us, because you would think that the people that foster youth that have been, or youth that have been in foster care, you really think that a higher proportion of them would be receiving financial aid. And so this raised the question that we're tackling here, which is what factors influenced whether youth formerly in foster care, right? That's the phrase I'm going to use. There's a lot of debate. Language, as we know, is really important. There's a lot of debate about what the kind of best language or what language should be used and the power of that language. I'm going to use this term youth formerly in foster care most often in this presentation. But we want to know what impacts whether or not those students received aid and whether those factors changed over time. So that's what we're trying to get at here in this study. So just briefly, I don't want to make any assumptions about foster care, what our knowledge is about foster care in the United States, if you're not familiar with it. But it's got an interesting, and with our current sort of present lenses, right, our present lenses, it's got an interesting sort of historical development. So this is a picture of our dogs, beloved baby Angel Blitzen and our dog Roxy. Wonderful animals. We love them very much. There are probably a lot of animal lovers out there today with us. So in 1874, a missionary named Etta Wheeler was very concerned about a youth named Mary Ellen Wilson. She was being neglected and abused. This was in Hell's Kitchen, New York, and she wanted to do something for her, but there were no legal remedies. There was no clear way to get that child into protective custody or out of that situation. So she reached out to Henry Berg, who was the founder of the American Society for the Prevention of Cruelty to Animals, ASPCA, very wealthy individual, and said, hey, can you help me? What can we do? So Berg got his attorney on it. They found a legal way to get Wilson out of the abusive home. And then Berg, a few years later, founded the New York Society for the Prevention of Cruelty to Children. So 2 things about that. One is that protection of animals preceded protection of children in this country, but that also the protection of children was for the most part, for the past 150 years, has been the purview of private organizations, okay? And all that changed in the 1950s. I won't get into that, there's not enough time, but it's just sort of the history of, a brief history of foster care in the US. So just a snapshot of what foster care looks like. In any given year, there are about 400 to 450,000 youth of all ages in many states, go up to 21 now, that were in care. They tend to be on the young side. You have your Black or African-American youth, and your Hispanic youth tend to be overrepresented in foster care. Among all age groups, neglect and drug abuse are the top reasons a child's removed. Now, if you look at your older youth, particularly among women, sexual abuse will be one of the top reasons that a youth is removed, but it's among all age groups. And again, about any given year, these are 2019 statistics here, but in any given year, about 20,000 youth age out or are emancipated. Just one thing to note that is unique or interesting about foster care is that when the state comes in and removes a child, they're doing two things. They're trying to get that child back in the home or that youth back in the home, while they're also essentially developing a contingency plan. So if they can't address the causes for removal, they're trying to find permanency, what they call permanency for that youth. And that is important because there are a lot of services that are in place, especially as youth get older, to help support them. And we're going to talk about some of those services and their impact on aid here shortly. So I'm going to try and avoid getting too much in the weeds on the ins and outs of this study, but I wanted to provide detail here. So for those of you that really want to dig into it, you can see what we did. And for those of you that don't want to dig into it, I'm trying to give you a sense of that our findings are in progress but legit. Okay, so our data come from what's called the National Data Archive on Child Abuse and Neglect. It's similar to IPEDS in many ways, but all of the state agencies that handle child welfare are required to report to the Children's Bureau and the federal government information about all youth in care and the services all youth receive, right? As well as, at least until age 21, the outcomes for those youth. So we're taking three data files here, one on foster care experiences, one on services, another on outcomes, merging them into a longitudinal data set. So we've got data on these youth at 3 time points, 17, 19, and 21. Now, just to give you a sense here, so for the youth that are in this baseline population at age 17, we started with 23,000 roughly students. When we winnow it down a little bit in terms of who actually responded to the survey, we get down to 16,000. Now, an exclusion criteria for this study was whether or not a youth had been incarcerated. And we do that because it's unlikely, in fact, you cannot get financial aid to go to college if you're incarcerated, and you're not going to be in post-secondary education if you're incarcerated. There are some ways where you can get aid, but anyway, so we excluded that. But I just want to pause and point out that 23% of the baseline population in our study was incarcerated. All right. So we end up with just over, or close to, I should say, 11,000 students. All right, so there's the data, that's the context. Going to get a little bit here into our sample and then dig into the findings and implications. All right, so just what you're looking at here is it's a table where we're breaking out in the first column whether or not someone received aid versus whether or not, whether they didn't receive aid versus whether they did receive aid. And these are some, but not all of the variables that we're looking at here in our models. I just want to kind of point out briefly some of the highlights here is that we do notice some differences. These are just bivariate differences in receipt of aid based on some demographic characteristics. So we see that women, a high proportion of women received financial aid than men, and the African-American or Black students and Hispanic students, African-American or Black students were somewhat underrepresented, and Hispanic students were somewhat overrepresented relative to non-aid recipients. Services there, looking a little bit further down. So these are different types of services that a youth would have received. A number of services matter, like academic support, so that'd be tutoring, different sort of academic tutoring support like that. Post-secondary educational support would be talking, sort of college counseling, career preparation, point out mentoring here, okay? Because that's something that will circle back to later, that we saw a difference as students who received mentoring were more likely to receive aid. Employment, and then finally, social supports, right? So if a student received public assistance, medical insurance, and was employed, they were more likely to have received financial aid to go to college, or post-secondary education, I should say. To be clear, post-secondary aid here, we're talking about anything beyond secondary education. It could be an associate's degree, a bachelor's degree, a shorter term credential. I'm really not going to bore folks with this, but I just want to just point out that we do have a conceptual framework here. And our conceptual framework, which we're borrowing from Ed St. John's work on financial nexus model and Yuri Brofenbrenner's work on ecological systems theory, these two things tell us to look at these 5 kind of constructs or blocks of variables. And the short of this is that we know financial aid matters for students if in terms of choosing a college and succeeding in college, and that context matters. That's all we need to know about that. Now, we are running, or we ran in this analysis a survival model. There's sometimes called event history analysis models. I'm going to pause here not to get into the equations. I don't particularly like the equations myself, but to say that this method comes from engineering and biology, where they were studying things like how long it took for a bridge to fail or how long it took for rats to die. So I say that, and that's important because the terminology that you will see coming up here can be problematic, especially when you're talking about groups who are marginalized. So you will see things like time to failure, hazard, at risk. That is language around the method and not the group. But the key things to point out here is that, again, our outcome is the likelihood of getting financial aid. We include those 3 time periods, 17, 19, 21, and then those, in the prior slide, I referenced those kind of 5 blocks of variables, those constructs. We have all those variables folded into our models here, representing student demographics and identity, academic support, and context, as well as finances and financial support. Now, here is an overview of the different models. We ran some quick things to point out. Here, really 2 things. One is that we did want to test for mediating relationships or interactions, right? So we didn't want to, we wanted to understand if some of these factors matter differently for different groups. So for example, one of the things we'll talk about is that a connection to an adult had a more positive impact on receiving aid for the Hispanic students in the sample than it did for the African-American or Black students compared to white. Okay, so that's what when I talk about interactions, that's what I mean. We also wanted to see if some of these things mattered at different points in time in different ways, right? So that's this time varying notion that aid may matter more at a certain point in someone's life. And if you think about it, that makes sense, right? I know financial aid mattered in my own life at different points to larger degrees. So for example, I probably wouldn't have got my master's degree if I hadn't been able to rely on good old loans. The last 3 models we ran are getting at a problem that is common in any education or policy studies, where we're trying to look at the relationship between interventions and effects or outcomes, right? And that is this idea of unobserved heterogeneity or self-selection or unobserved variable bias. It's called different things. But this idea that, like, so for example, when we talk about services that students receive and whether students that, for example, receive post-secondary education support were more likely to get financial aid. Well, it may not be that post-secondary education supports lead to getting financial aid. It could be someone that seeks out these supports or services is also more likely to seek out these other supports or services in terms of financial aid. And if you don't account for that, in that case, self-motivation, then your results are going to be wrong, essentially. So we try to do some fancy modeling to try and address that. All I have to say is we have some confidence in the results here, the gist of the results. So going into the final stretch here with the findings. So I want to make sure there's some time for questions. Just to give you a sense as I'm going through some of the findings, some of the tables from our models, things to be paying attention to, right? So these could be like the learning objectives for the lesson, right? But pay attention to what you see and what I talk about in terms of having a connection to an adult. The support services, there are a number of support services that were positively related to receiving aid. We included state aid programs in our model. So if a student was in a state like Kentucky has a tuition waiver, if a youth was in foster care at any point in their lives, that student could go to any public institution in the state, all tuition is paid for. And many states, in fact, most states have different programs, whether it's a tuition waiver, specific scholarships or grants that are targeted toward youth that were in foster care. We included those. And then also I encourage us to think about this idea of financial aid is necessary but not sufficient, right? And financial aid research, in my opinion, we haven't done enough to take in kind of this context, these webs of support of which financial aid is one part. But what we argue here at the end is that those webs of support are themselves important in students being able to receive financial aid. So what you are looking at now is really the X denotes when a student received financial aid. And so for example, for that first row there, 1,394 students, or 37% of the students, received financial aid at age 19, but not prior or not after that, not at age 21. The second most common pattern, right, so we're just looking at patterns of aid receipt here. The second most common pattern of aid receipt was that students received it at 19 and 21. Now, in thinking about this, unfortunately, the data that we get, that you get from the Children's Bureau, it doesn't have good education data and it's not longitudinal in post-secondary ed. So we don't know what kinds of degree programs these students went into, but we would hypothesize that these two patterns of aid that you are seeing would jibe with students who may be getting a short-term degree or maybe getting an associate's degree. And I should note too that this is a very short time frame too. We're only following these students up to 21. I suspect if we followed students out longer, we would see a greater proportion receiving financial aid and then ultimately completing a post-secondary degree. So this is where we get into the problematic language that I mentioned before, but this is a pretty standard Kaplan-Meier failure function for students. And kind of the things to point out here is, so the wave is the age at risk. That means how many people are in the sample. Note that there is a fair bit of attrition in the sample over time. So we end up with a fairly small sample by the end, by age 21. Fail means students who received aid, so it's not actually failure. And then the failure function here, I just want to point out, it's not, again, that's what that represents is basically the chance of whether or not someone received financial aid at that given age. And we see that that increases over time. However, that's probably mostly a function of what is called the risk pool or the risk set. And what that basically means is there are a lot fewer people left standing in the sample, in the survey. And so those that receive aid, you have a higher likelihood of getting aid because there are just fewer people overall. All right, so I'm going to go through the kind of the 5 blocks of variables that I talked about before, starting with the demographics. Stick with me, I'm not going to spend a lot of time on this, but I just want to point out that in terms of when a student was most likely to receive aid, age 19 compared to age 17 was that point in time. Interestingly, right, Black or African American students were more likely to receive financial aid than white youth who had been in foster care. We said Hispanic students were less likely, and oh, sorry, I jumped ahead. And I should note, I was surprised to see that there was really no difference in terms of having reported disability. Now, disabilities can include physical and mental health disabilities in the sample, and youth that have been in foster care tend to have a relatively high proportion to the general population will have a reported disability. And I was surprised to see that there was no difference there. And I'm not sure why that wasn't significant. So academic support. So students that received academic support were marginally more likely to receive financial aid. We see a pretty big difference here in terms of likelihood of students receiving post-secondary educational support, receiving financial aid. Now, pause, just remember, we are controlling as much as possible here for self-selection. So if you're sitting there thinking, well, of course, because they were more likely to go out and get, post-secondary educational support, and then they go get the financial aid. We as much as possible controlled for that here. So we see that in and of itself, post-secondary educational support was pretty significantly and pretty has a pretty big effect size there in terms of receiving financial aid. Now, so family microsystem, family context here, you can see how we operationalize this construct. We're still playing with how we're operationalizing some of these constructs, but interestingly, right, and these variables that you see here, right, they're related to foster care, but they're really related to what was going on in the family before a youth was removed. None of these were statistically significant. Now, I'm not saying they don't matter, but they're not statistically significant. And that, frankly, was a little surprising. So when we look at foster care here, and we're starting to get into some of the services that are provided to students, I mentioned this earlier, but we see that youth that were employed full or part-time were a little bit more likely to receive financial aid. Being married or having children was negatively related to getting financial aid, as was being homeless. And I mentioned this earlier in the preview, the state grant programs for youth that were formerly in foster care, okay, tuition waiver was maybe, you could argue, marginally significant, but overall, these didn't seem to have a great impact. I'll talk a little bit more about that here as I wrap up. So finally, the finances and the financial support. So we see that other forms of financial assistance, and there's a whole bunch wrapped into that variable, but that is positively related to receiving financial aid. Room and board financial assistance and medical insurance were all associated with a student being more likely or a youth being more likely to receive financial aid. Now, I mentioned earlier that we tested some interactions and time-varying variables. I'm not going to go through those results in as much depth as I did the prior results, but I would just note that so the connection to an adult, we saw that it had a statistically significant and fairly large impact on whether or not someone received financial aid. So we interacted that with gender and race. It was not significant by gender or for African American or Black students, but for Hispanic students, as I mentioned earlier, it was significant, right? So connection to an adult for an Hispanic student matters differently than for an African American or Black student, at least according to our results. And the same was true of other race students. And we saw that those variables mattered at different points in times in different ways. So connection to an adult at age 19 compared to 17, connection to an adult had a greater effect on receiving financial aid at age 19. In fact, it was the greatest effect at age 19 compared to 17. We see, though, even at age 21, having that connection to an adult was significant and increased the odds of receiving financial aid compared to age 17. Health insurance, the effects of that, the impact of that, the effect size of that grew essentially as the student aged. So implications. Again, this is where we're sort of thinking things through here, so we welcome feedback and comments from folks. Gosh, it seems clear that this connection to adults is really important, right? It was one of the most impactful variables in terms of effect size. Now, and that was after controlling for mentoring, right? So mentoring, as you may recall, was actually also positively related to a student receiving aid, but this connection to an adult is important. And maybe that's not surprising. If we think back, those of us that are fortunate to have adults in our lives that have helped us grow and have taken care of us, maybe that makes sense. But we see here that really matters. We see that the connection to adult matters at different points in time, right? And it matters for different racial and ethnic groups, at least for, in our study, Hispanic and other race students, more than other groups, right? And we saw some support services that work here, right? So the post-secondary education support was positively related. Mentoring, as I mentioned, was positively related to receiving aid. And then these other forms of financial assistance, in addition to those other support services, were positively related. So, what does this mean? Well, financial aid research, I would argue, as I said, needs to be more holistic in its approach. we know there's plenty of research that says aid is positively related to completion. But if students aren't getting it, then it doesn't really matter, right? And we have argued and we've talked about how there isn't enough aid. But even of that aid where there's not enough, it's not going to the most marginalized students. So we need to make sure that they get it, first of all. And then also, I think our findings point to this implication of this web of support, whether it's mentoring, connections to adults, housing supports, medical insurance. Students need that to get aid and to get into school and succeed in school. And this is obviously not the first study that has shown that. So some head scratchers for us, right? So the employment variable, being employed mattered in terms of receiving aid, was statistically related to receiving aid, but the career preparation and the employment or vocational training programs were not. And I frankly have no idea why. And maybe in this case, employment is a proxy for something else, such as self-motivation, resiliency, self-organization. I'm not sure, but that surprised me that the employment was significant, but not the other variables. And then finally, we need to get our heads around why those state aid programs aren't significant. And it just may be a function of our modeling. I mean, we didn't do a multi-level model. We don't have a lot of state information in there. Frankly, there was a pretty small sample, so you start to cut these students across 50 states, and it just may not be popping statistically. But that is an interesting question because a lot of policy discussion has been around those state programs. That's it. There's my contact information. I welcome questions.
Well, thank you, Jake. Yeah, we have time for one great question for Jake.
I have a question.
Go for it.
Okay, Jake, I work in the high schools, and one of the things I'm finding with the seniors who are in foster care don't like to disclose the fact that they have been in foster care. It's almost like a stigma. So therefore, they won't seek the counseling of the counselor or the college advisor so that they will know that there's money, the tuition waiver, the state aid, and the ETV. I'm having a hard time getting students to apply for the ETV. And a lot of it has to do with how they see themselves. And several of them have told me that they're not trying to go to college now. They're just trying to get out of the foster home. So they want to access services that will get them into a stable home and a job and employment. Maybe that's why the 17-year-old coming out of school is not trying to access financial aid. And maybe once they're 19, they see the validity of trying to go back to school and get the financial aid. That's just has been my experience.
Yeah, no, I appreciate that, and I could offer some comments on that, but you're actually in there in the high schools working with those youth, which I'm not. I think, as you're saying, there's a lot going on there, and I think one of the comments I know I hear from social work colleagues is, yeah, higher ed's great, but there's just so much else to address that has to come later. So thank you for that.
Well, the other problem is that the social workers who are supposed to be helping these kids in foster care are not doing or not exercising the effort that they would like. I had a lot of problems trying to contact social workers because they had to make sure that the student's name was on the health and services list. So when colleges contacted that department to say, is Miss Jackson on, was she in foster care, to verify so she could ask for that tuition waiver, it's a lot of bureaucratic, it's just a mess. So kids say, forget it. That's just, forget it, it's too much.
Yeah, no, I couldn't, I think you sum it up. It's the system's a mess, and with no disrespect to my colleagues who are in the field or who are social workers, I'm not sure that system can be fixed in the short term, and I think it's incumbent upon us in education to try and fill some of those gaps.
Awesome. Once again, thank you, Jake. Much appreciated for this work.
Thank you all, appreciate it.